Imagine a world where the very things that make us shudder today were once considered perfectly normal. Practices we now label as forbidden or taboo were everyday realities for our ancestors, woven into the fabric of ancient life with a casual acceptance that might shock our modern sensibilities. We often view history through a lens polished by centuries of progress, assuming that what we deem unacceptable must have always been so. But the truth is far more complex and far more fascinating. What if I told you that some of the most startling and mysterious rituals from the past were not the work of a fringe few, but common practices embraced by entire civilizations? This is the world of forbidden ancient knowledge practices that have slipped through the cracks of time, leaving us to wonder how something so strange could ever have been ordinary. Throughout human history, societies have operated under wildly different moral and cultural codes. Actions that today would be met with outrage or disbelief were once standard procedure, whether for spiritual, medicinal, or simply practical reasons. From ceremonial rites that challenge our understanding of humanity to medical treatments that walk the line between genius and madness, these forgotten customs reveal just how fluid our ideas of right and wrong truly are. They force us to question not only the past but ourselves. What will future generations think of our own unquestioned norms? What pieces of our daily lives might one day be regarded with the same mix of curiosity and horror that we now reserve for the ancients? In this video, we're going to explore 25 such practices, each one a window into a world that operated by a different set of rules. We'll travel across time and continents, from the shadowy temples of Mesopotamia to the bustling forums of ancient Rome, uncovering secrets that have long been buried by sand, time, and changing values. You'll discover why certain rituals were performed, what they meant to the people who practiced them, and how something once so common could become so utterly forbidden. This isn't just a list of oddities, it's a journey into the heart of what it means to be human, to adapt, to evolve, and sometimes to look back in awe at the paths we once walked. So settle in and prepare to see history in a whole new light. Our journey into the forbidden begins with perhaps the most jarring practice to the modern mind, the widespread and systematic offering of human life to the divine. Far from being a rare or aberrant act, human sacrifice was a cornerstone of religious and state power in numerous ancient civilizations, viewed not as a crime but as a sacred, necessary duty. The Aztec Empire, for instance, operated on a cosmological principle that the sun god Huitzilopochtli required constant nourishment, human blood, to rise each day and stave off the eternal darkness that would end the world. This belief translated into ceremonies of staggering scale. At the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, priests would perform the act of heart extraction, holding the still-beating organ aloft to the sun before placing it in a ceremonial vessel and ceremonially burning the body. The steps of the temple would run red, a sight as common to an Aztec citizen as the ringing of church bells might be in a European city. But who were the people chosen for this ultimate offering? While popular imagination might conjure images of terrified slaves dragged kicking and screaming to the altar, the reality was far more complex. Many were willing participants, believing they were embarking on a sacred journey to join the gods, a tremendous honor for themselves and their families. A significant portion were also prisoners of war, their capture on the battlefield seen as a divine selection, and their sacrifice served a dual purpose. It fed the gods while simultaneously demonstrating the immense power of the Aztec state. This was not an act hidden away in secret. It was a public spectacle, a core part of the community's spiritual and social fabric, accompanied by elaborate rituals, music, and dance. The Maya, contemporaries of the Aztecs, also engaged in these practices, often throwing sacrificial victims into sacred cenotes, deep natural wells, as an offering to the rain god Chak. Across the Atlantic, the Carthaginians, a Phoenician civilization in North Africa, practiced child sacrifice, cremating infants and burying their charred remains in special cemeteries known as tophets, often with inscribed stone markers dedicated to the gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. The scale of these practices is what truly challenges our understanding. Some scholarly estimates, based on archaeological evidence and colonial records, suggest that in a single ceremony to reconsecrate the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in the year 1487, as many as 20,000 people may have been sacrificed over just 4 days. This wasn't a hidden atrocity. It was, for its time, a normal and indeed essential expression of faith and power, a stark reminder that one society's taboo is another's sacred obligation. While the concept of sacrificing a warrior to the gods is alien to us, the deliberate ending of a newborn's life is a far more intimate and, for the ancient world, a far more common form of forbidden practice. If human sacrifice was a grand, state-sanctioned spectacle, infanticide was its quiet, domestic counterpart, a grim form of family planning and population control practiced with shocking regularity across the classical world. In the societies we often hail as the cradles of Western civilization, Rome, Greece, and most infamously Sparta, the exposure of an unwanted infant was not a crime. It was a parent's legal right and, in many cases, a social expectation. The reasons for abandoning a newborn were as varied as they were heartbreaking. Poverty was a primary driver. A family already struggling to feed its existing members could scarcely afford another mouth. A physical deformity or illness in the child was another common cause, seen not through a modern lens of medical compassion, but through a pragmatic one of perceived weakness and future burden. Perhaps the most pervasive motive, however, was simple gender preference. In a patriarchal world where sons carried on the family name, inherited property, and provided for parents in old age, daughters were often viewed as a financial liability, requiring a substantial dowry to be married off. A plethora of surviving letters from Roman Egypt capture this cold calculus perfectly. One letter from a man named Hilarion to his pregnant wife Olis reads with chilling brevity, "If you happen to give birth, if it is a boy, let it live, if it is a girl, expose it." The mechanism for this was exposure. This did not typically involve direct violence. Instead, an unwanted infant would be left in a designated public place, a hillside, a trash heap, or more famously in Rome, at the Columna Lactaria, and left to the elements and to fate. There was always a chance, however slim, that a childless couple or a slave trader might find and take the baby in, but for most, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. This act was so normalized that Roman law under the 12 Tables explicitly granted the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, the absolute power to decide whether a newborn was raised or exposed, a right that would not be challenged for centuries. No society, however, institutionalized this practice with the brutal efficiency of Sparta. Here, infanticide was not a family decision but a matter of state policy. Every newborn was brought before a council of elders known as the Gerousia for a literal fitness test. The child was examined for any sign of weakness, deformity, or imperfection. Those who passed inspection were deemed worthy of being raised as Spartan citizens. Those who failed were not merely exposed, they were thrown into a chasm on Mount Taygetus known as the Apothete, or the place of rejection. This state-mandated eugenics program was designed to ensure the legendary strength of the Spartan warrior class, creating a society so militarily formidable that its entire social structure was built upon the subjugation of a massive slave population, the Helots. The Spartan ideal of perfection came at the most horrific price imaginable, a stark reminder that even the most celebrated ancient cultures were built upon foundations that are, by any modern standard, utterly unconscionable. Moving from the quiet, domestic tragedy of infanticide, we arrive at the roaring, blood-soaked spectacle of the Roman arena, a practice so public and so celebrated that its brutality shocks us even today. Gladiatorial combat stands as one of history's most iconic and complex forbidden practices, a system where state-sanctioned murder was transformed into the ancient world's most popular form of mass entertainment. But to dismiss it as mere bloodsport is to miss its profound significance. The games were a multi-faceted tool, a brutal theater where power, politics, and social order were performed for an audience of tens of thousands. At its heart, the gladiatorial system was a massive, industrialized machine of violence. The participants, known as gladiators, were most often slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, though they were occasionally free citizens who willingly signed a contract with a Lannister, the owner of a gladiatorial troupe, often for a share of the prize money and the remote chance of fame and freedom. Their lives were spent in specialized training schools, the ludi, where they were drilled in specific forms of combat. Unlike the chaotic brawls often depicted in film, these were highly stylized duels between different classes of fighters, each with their own distinct armor and weaponry designed to create a visually engaging and balanced match. There was the secutor, the chaser, with his rounded helmet and large shield, designed to fight the retiarius, the net and trident-wielding fisherman. The mirmillo, with his fish-crested helmet, often faced the threeks, who wielded a distinctive curved sword. This variety turned death into a sport with rules, referees, and different levels of celebrity for its stars. The stage for this deadly drama was the amphitheater, and its crown jewel was the Flavian amphitheater, known to the world as the Colosseum. This architectural marvel could seat over 50,000 spectators, all arranged in a strict hierarchy that mirrored Roman society itself. The emperor and the Vestal virgins had the best views in the front rows, with senators, equestrians, and other citizens arrayed behind them, and slaves and women relegated to the highest, worst seats. This seating chart was a constant, visible reminder of everyone's place in the Roman world. The games themselves, which could last for dozens of days in a row, were paid for by wealthy politicians or the emperor himself as a form of public benefaction, a way to gain popularity and demonstrate immense wealth and power. The message was clear: the state could command not only life and death but could package it as a gift for the masses. This brings us to the core function of the games, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. By providing free grain and free, thrilling entertainment, the ruling elite effectively distracted the population of Rome from political discontent and social inequality. The arena became a pressure valve for a vast and often restless urban population. Furthermore, the games served a deeper psychological purpose. The ritualized violence and the spectacle of seeing criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state executed in creatively brutal ways reinforced Roman values of discipline, courage, and most importantly, the absolute power of Rome over its adversaries and its own people. It was a public lesson in the consequences of defiance. The ultimate expression of this twisted power dynamic came when the emperor himself entered the arena. While most emperors watched from the safety of the imperial box, a few, like the infamous Commodus, took to the sand personally. He would perform as a secutor, fighting gladiators and exotic beasts, always in rigged matches where his victory was assured. For the Roman elite, this was not a display of strength but a profound and embarrassing breach of decorum. The most powerful man in the world debasing himself by performing as a common, despised entertainer. For Commodus, however, it was the ultimate flex of imperial authority, demonstrating that even the gods' representative on earth could dominate the arena. His participation blurred the line between ruler and performer, sovereign and slave, taking a system built on control and hierarchy to its most ludicrous and terrifying extreme. The gladiatorial games were far more than a sport. They were the beating, bloody heart of a civilization that wielded violence as both a political tool and a public pastime. But if the arena represented a brutal form of state-controlled power, another ancient practice reveals a world where sexuality itself was seen as a direct conduit to the divine. We now turn to one of the most misunderstood and controversial customs, the concept of sacred prostitution, a ritual where physical intimacy was not a private act but a public offering to the gods. This practice, deeply embedded in the cultures of Mesopotamia, Greece, and India, fundamentally challenges our modern separation of the spiritual and the sensual, presenting a world view where fertility of the land, of livestock, and of people was the highest form of divine blessing and ensuring it required the most intimate of sacrifices. In the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, this devotion centered on the goddess Ishtar, known as Inanna in earlier Sumerian myths. She was a complex deity of love, war, and most importantly, fertility. The great temple dedicated to her in the city of Uruk, the Ina, was not just a place of prayer, it was a thriving economic and spiritual hub where a unique class of priestesses, known as Intu, Nadatu, or Kaddish-tu, the sacred women, resided. During annual festivals like the Akitu or New Year, it was believed the goddess's earthly power peaked, and a ritual known as the sacred marriage would often be performed. In this rite, the high priestess would embody Ishtar herself, and either the king or a high priest would take on the role of her consort, Dumuzi. Their physical union was not seen as scandalous but as a solemn duty, a symbolic act meant to magically ensure the fertility of the entire kingdom for the coming year. The prosperity of the crops, the health of the royal line, and the very stability of the state were thought to hinge on this ceremonial act. Beyond this elite ritual, the practice likely extended to other women serving the temple. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, provided the most famous and hotly debated account of this system in Babylon. He described a law requiring every woman in the land, at least once in her lifetime, to travel to the sanctuary of Ishtar, sit in its sacred precincts, and offer herself to a stranger. After this act, she would present the monetary offering she received to the temple coffers. While modern scholars debate the absolute accuracy of Herodotus's description, often viewing it through the lens of Greek fascination with barbarian customs, his account points to a perceived link between sexuality, religious devotion, and economic function that was utterly foreign to the Greek mind. For a Mesopotamian woman, this act may have been a one-time rite of passage, a personal offering to the goddess to secure her own fertility and future marriage, all while contributing to the immense wealth of the temple institution. This concept of sexuality in service to a goddess traveled westward, transforming into the worship of Aphrodite in places like Corinth, Greece. The Corinthian temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth was said by the geographer Strabo to employ over 1,000 hieroduloi, or sacred slaves. These women served as both priestesses and companions to devotees who visited the temple. For a man seeking favor before a voyage or a business venture, making an offering to the goddess through one of her attendants was seen as a potent way to gain divine blessing. The practice generated enormous revenue for the city, making Corinth synonymous with both luxury and a kind of sanctioned libertinism that more conservative city-states like Sparta looked upon with disdain. Here, the lines were explicitly blurred. The temple was a place of worship, a bank, and a brothel, all operating under the aegis of a powerful deity. Similarly, in ancient India, texts and temple sculptures attest to the existence of the Devadasis, servants of the god. Young girls were dedicated to a temple deity, such as Shiva or Vishnu, and were trained in intricate dance, music, and ritual arts. Their performances were considered an essential part of temple worship, a form of divine entertainment. While their initial role was purely sacred, over centuries the system became corrupted, particularly during the medieval period, with some Devadasis entering into relationships with wealthy temple patrons or priests. This complex system combined extreme artistic skill with religious devotion, and in many cases, eventual exploitation. A far cry from its original spiritual intent, but rooted in that ancient belief in connecting the human and the divine through feminine grace and sexuality. The underlying thread connecting all these varied traditions is the elemental connection between human fertility and the Earth's abundance. In a world utterly dependent on agriculture, the forces that made the land yield crops and women bear children were mysterious, powerful, and deemed worthy of the highest forms of supplication. To offer one's own body in a ritual act was to participate directly in this cosmic cycle of creation and renewal. It was a transaction with the divine, ensuring community prosperity and divine favor through the most personal of currencies. This worldview stands in stark contrast to the later moral frameworks that often positioned sexuality in opposition to holiness, revealing a time when the sacred was not separate from the physical world but deeply, intimately embedded within it. From the sacred intimacy of temple rites, we now venture into one of the most viscerally shocking and universally taboo subjects, the consumption of human flesh. Cannibalism stands as perhaps the ultimate forbidden practice in the modern mind, an act that symbolizes the complete collapse of civilization and morality. Yet for many ancient cultures, it was not an act of savage desperation but a deeply ritualized practice imbued with profound spiritual meaning, a way to harness power, honor the dead, and even achieve salvation. We must first distinguish between two primary forms of this practice: survival cannibalism, the consumption of the dead to avoid starvation, is a tragic, ad hoc response to extreme circumstances documented throughout history, from stranded explorers to besieged cities. The form that truly challenges our understanding, however, is ritual or endemic cannibalism, a culturally sanctioned and structured practice. A compelling and controversial example comes from the American Southwest, among the ancestral pueblones of sites like Cowboy Wash in Colorado. Archaeological excavations there have uncovered human bones dating to around the mid-12th century that tell a grim story. The remains from at least 7 individuals show clear evidence of butchering, cut marks identical to those found on animal bones, patterns of burning indicative of cooking, and even pot shards with residues of human myoglobin, a protein found only in heart and skeletal muscle. This suggests not a simple act of starvation, but a systematic process of preparation and consumption. Some anthropologists theorize this occurred during a period of severe drought and social collapse, where extreme stress may have triggered a breakdown of norms and the emergence of violence that included ritualized cannibalism as a form of terror, or perhaps even a perverted attempt to magically absorb the strength of the victims. Far to the south, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the act took on a vastly different, more integrated meaning, particularly among the Aztecs. While human sacrifice to feed the gods was the primary religious act, there is strong evidence that a form of ritual cannibalism followed. After a captive warrior's heart was offered to the sun, his body was treated with reverence. It was often rolled down the temple steps to the waiting populace below. The limbs were then ritually prepared and consumed in a sacred feast by the warrior's captor and the noble elite. The spiritual logic behind this was powerful and specific. The Aztecs believed they lived in a universe sustained by a sacred life force, a kind of spiritual energy they called teolia, which resided primarily in the heart, and tonali, which resided in the head. By consuming the flesh of a brave captive, a warrior wasn't just having a meal. He was literally incorporating the tonali, the strength and courage of the defeated enemy, into his own being. It was the ultimate act of spiritual recycling and a tremendous honor for the consumed individual whose valor lived on in his captor. This was not a secret or shameful act, but the final, necessary step in a cosmic transaction that maintained the world order. This complex spiritual dimension makes the accusations leveled against early Christians by the Roman Empire so particularly ironic. Romans, who themselves reveled in the bloodsport of the arena, viewed the new Christian sect with deep suspicion. Their rituals were secretive, they refused to honor the Roman gods, and they spoke metaphysically of consuming the body and blood of their founder. outsiders took this language literally. Rumors swirled that these atheists engaged in Theastian feasts a reference to the mythological Greek king who was tricked into eating his own sons, and Oedipodian intercourse, accusing them of both cannibalism and incest. The Christian practice of the Eucharist, where believers symbolically consume bread and wine transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ, was willfully misinterpreted as evidence of these grotesque rumors. These accusations provided a powerful pretext for persecution, showing how the mere perception of cannibalism could be used as the ultimate psychological weapon to dehumanize a minority and justify its extermination. And as a weapon, it was employed with terrifying effectiveness. Numerous cultures used the threat or practice of cannibalism to inflict psychological trauma far greater than any physical wound. In parts of West Africa, warriors of certain groups believed eating the heart or other organs of a brave enemy would transfer their courage. In New Zealand, Maori warriors would sometimes consume slain enemies to utterly dominate them, absorbing their mana or spiritual power while simultaneously delivering the ultimate insult to their ancestors, leaving no body to be buried and honored. This practice, known as ungakinga, was designed to break the enemy's spirit completely, creating a fear that went beyond death itself. The goal was not sustenance but total psychic annihilation, a message that even in death, their enemy would know no peace and retain no dignity. This use of cannibalism reveals its ultimate function as a tool of terror, a way to demonstrate absolute power by violating the most fundamental boundary of human existence. Leaving behind the visceral terror of cannibalism, we journey into the misty highlands and deep oak groves of ancient Gaul and Britain, where another form of ritual killing was said to flourish, not as a public spectacle, but as a mysterious and sacred rite performed by the enigmatic Celtic priests known as the Druids. Our understanding of their practices is almost entirely filtered through the writings of their greatest adversaries, the Romans, and no account is more influential or more contentious than that of Julius Caesar in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars. For Caesar, the Druids were not just religious leaders, they were the intellectual and judicial backbone of the tribes he sought to conquer, making them a primary target for both military and propaganda campaigns. Caesar, along with other historians like Strabo and Pliny the Elder, described a religious system that relied heavily on human sacrifice to gain the favor of the gods. The methods were varied and ghastly. Some victims, often criminals or prisoners of war, were stabbed in the back as a form of divination, with priests reading the future in their death spasms and the flow of their blood. Others were drowned in bogs or deep lakes as offerings to water deities, their bodies weighted down and preserved in the peat to be discovered millennia later, like the famous Lindo Man in England. But the most enduring and terrifying image is the Wicker Man. Caesar described a colossal effigy woven from willow branches, its limbs and torso forming cages that were filled with living victims, men, women, and animals. This giant statue was then set ablaze, a roaring inferno of sacrifice intended to appease the gods and ensure prosperity. The religious logic behind these acts, as the Romans reported it, was multifaceted. Sacrifices were tied to the agricultural calendar, crucial for ensuring fertile land and abundant harvests. They were also a means of divination, a way to peer into the future during times of uncertainty, such as before a battle or the inauguration of a new chieftain. Most importantly, the Druids allegedly believed in a form of divine transference. They held that the gods would only accept a life in exchange for a life. To spare a human from illness or misfortune, another human life had to be offered up. This created a complex economy of souls where the sacrifice of a criminal was seen as particularly pleasing to the gods, serving both a spiritual and a social function by purging the community of its worst elements. This grisly portrayal, however, is the subject of intense modern debate. How much of it is historical fact and how much is purposeful Roman propaganda? There is a strong argument that Caesar and his contemporaries had a vested interest in painting the Celts as monstrous, superstitious barbarians. By depicting their religious practices as savage and inhuman, Caesar justified his brutal military campaign as a civilizing mission, bringing Roman law and order to a land drenched in blood. It was a powerful tool to secure support back in Rome and morally legitimize the conquest and subjugation of millions of people. The Wicker Man, in particular, with its theatrical and horrific nature, reads like a perfect piece of atrocity propaganda designed to horrify and alienate a Roman readership. Archaeology has struggled to provide definitive proof. While numerous bog bodies have been found across northern Europe showing signs of violent death, it is often impossible to distinguish a ritual sacrifice from a simple execution or murder. The grand, fiery spectacle of the Wicker Man would leave little to no archaeological evidence behind ashes and a few post holes that could be interpreted in countless ways. The absence of concrete proof doesn't mean the Romans invented it outright, but it forces us to view their accounts with extreme skepticism. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. The Druids almost certainly practiced some form of human sacrifice, as it was a known element in many ancient religions. But the scale and the specific, lurid details reported by the Romans were probably exaggerated, twisted to serve a political purpose. The Druids, the intellectual elite of a culture that was systematically erased, have been forever shadowed by the accusations of their conquerors, their true nature lost somewhere between the silent oaks and the roaring flames of a propaganda war fought 2,000 years ago. Yet another practice, born from a complex mix of spirituality and social control, would push the ideal of female devotion to its most horrific and final extreme. In the annals of forbidden customs, few are as haunting as sati, the practice where a widow would immolate herself alive on her husband's funeral pyre. The word itself derives from the Sanskrit word sati, meaning a virtuous woman, and it is tied to the goddess Sati, the first wife of Shiva, who self-immolated in a fire of her own making after her father insulted her husband. This mythological precedent was used for centuries to frame an act of profound violence as the ultimate expression of a wife's devotion and purity. The origins of sati in India are ancient, with the earliest archaeological evidence coming from inscriptions and accounts from the Kushan and Rajput periods. It was never a universal or uniformly practiced custom across the entire subcontinent, but was instead concentrated in certain regions and among specific castes, particularly the warrior Rajput clans of Rajasthan. For these communities where honor was paramount, a widow's self-sacrifice was seen as the final, glorious act of a marriage, ensuring her husband's soul a place in heaven and bringing immense prestige and spiritual merit to her family. The event was often treated not as a tragedy but as a celebration, with the woman dressed in her marriage finery, accompanied by music and chanting as she made her way to the pyre. She was called a sati mata, a mother goddess, and stones called sati stones were often erected to mark the spot and become sites of veneration. But behind this spiritual ideal lay a much grimmer social and economic reality. The practice was intensely wrapped up in issues of property, inheritance, and the perceived threat of a woman's uncontrolled sexuality. In a deeply patriarchal society, a widow was often seen as a burden, another mouth to feed, and a potential claimant to her husband's estate. More darkly, she was viewed as a source of temptation and sin, her very existence a threat to the moral order. A voluntary sati solved all these problems at once. It removed an economic liability, prevented any disputes over inheritance, and permanently enshrined the family's honor. The line between voluntary and forced, however, was terrifyingly thin. While some accounts describe women going willingly to the pyre, often under the influence of religious ecstasy or overwhelming social pressure, numerous historical records from the Mughal era and British colonial officials describe horrific scenes of women being drugged, tied to the pyre with heavy logs, or pushed back into the flames with long bamboo poles when they tried to escape. Agonizing fate, the British East India Company, initially reluctant to interfere with local customs, began to push for abolition in the early 19th century as evangelical Christian reformers and utilitarian officials like Governor-General Lord William Bentinck deemed the practice barbaric. The final catalyst was the advocacy of Indian reformers themselves, most notably the Bengali scholar Roger Ram Mohan Roy, who argued vehemently that sati had no true sanction in the core Hindu scriptures. He pointed out that key texts like the Rig Veda actually prescribed a life of austerity and prayer for widows, not death. After extensive debate, the Bengal Sati Regulation, or Regulation 17, was passed in 1829, declaring the practice illegal and punishable by courts as culpable homicide. The ban was a landmark moment, a collision between colonial power and indigenous social reform that fundamentally altered the landscape of tradition, setting a precedent for the state to intervene in religious practices deemed inhuman. It marked the beginning of the end for a ritual that conflated a woman's worth with her husband's life, transforming an act of supposed sacred duty into one of history's most chilling examples of systemic oppression. While the Druids and their alleged sacrifices represent a world of ritual power, another form of shedding blood was practiced not in sacred groves but in the physician's chamber with a startlingly different intent. Across the ancient and medieval world, from the banks of the Nile to the halls of European universities, the practice of bloodletting was not a fringe superstition but the cornerstone of mainstream medicine for over 2,000 years. This was a world governed by the theory of the four humors, a system devised by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later expanded by Galen in Rome. The body was seen as a delicate balance of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was believed to be the result of an excess or imbalance of one of these humors, and the logical cure was to remove the surplus. For an overabundance of blood, the most common diagnosis, the remedy was simple: open a vein and let it flow. The tools and techniques were surprisingly sophisticated. Physicians used a specialized instrument called a lancet, or a fleam, a multi-bladed, spring-loaded device that could make a quick, deep incision. The procedure was often tailored to the specific ailment and the patient's constitution. Blood might be drawn from a vein in the arm for a general fever, or from a vein behind the ear for a severe headache. The amount of blood removed was staggering by modern standards. Pints could be taken in a single session, often until the patient fainted, which was taken as a sign that the balance had been achieved. This practice was ubiquitous. The Romans were particularly enthusiastic, with public baths often having a designated area for bloodletting. Even the mighty gladiators, symbols of peak physical prowess, would regularly undergo the procedure as a form of preventative maintenance to maintain their optimal humoral balance. But the medical use of the human body did not stop at simply spilling blood. A far more macabre and persistent tradition emerged: the consumption of human remains as medicine. This practice, known as medicinal cannibalism, saw nearly every part of the human body, from blood and bone to fat and flesh, ground, distilled, or concocted into remedies that were dispensed by respected apothecaries and prescribed by learned doctors well into the 18th century. The logic was rooted in the principle of sympathetic magic and a belief in the vital essence contained within the human form. If a substance came from a powerful, healthy, or tragically deceased person, that power could be transferred to the ailing patient. The most sought-after ingredient was Egyptian mummy or mumia. Originally, this referred to a bituminous substance that seeped from the mountains of Persia, believed to have powerful curative properties. But as demand soared and the original substance became scarce, a gruesome substitution took place. European apothecaries began importing actual mummified bodies from Egypt, prizing them for their ancient, preserved state. These were not carefully studied artifacts, but commodities to be pulverized into a dark powder. Mummy powder was prescribed for everything from headaches and epilepsy to preventing internal bleeding and bruising. It was considered a near-universal panacea, and its popularity created a thriving and gruesome trade. Unscrupulous merchants even began faking mummies by burying and desiccating the bodies of executed criminals or slaves to meet the insatiable European demand. Fresh blood was another prized elixir, its use steeped in the belief that it contained the very spark of life. In ancient Rome, spectators in the arena would rush to drink the blood of a freshly slain gladiator, hoping to absorb his strength and vitality and cure their epilepsy. This practice persisted for centuries. The 17th century English philosopher Francis Bacon recorded that patients would wait at the foot of the gallows, cups in hand, to drink the still warm blood of an executed criminal. Human fat, known as exsungia hominis, was rendered into salves and ointments for treating wounds, gout, and arthritis. Moss growing on a human skull was collected and distilled into a tincture to stop nosebleeds, and a king's touch was believed to cure scrofula, known as the king's evil. Perhaps the most chilling preparation was usnea, a moss that was supposedly scraped from the skull of a hanged man who had been left to weather on the gibbet. This ingredient was considered most potent if the man had died a violent death and his life force had, in theory, saturated his very bones. This grim harvest required a specific and ghastly timing. The body had to be collected at the precise moment of decay to acquire the moss. The resulting powder was then ingested to treat epilepsy and other neurological ailments. The persistence of these practices reveals a profound and long-held belief in the human body as the ultimate apothecary, a repository of potent cures that simply needed to be unlocked, no matter how horrifying the method. It was a form of medicine that blurred the line between healing and horror, one that remained firmly entrenched in European pharmacopoeias until the dawn of the scientific revolution finally began to dismantle the ancient humoral theory it was built upon. Yet even the purpose of warfare itself could be twisted to serve a higher, far more terrifying spiritual mandate. For the Aztecs, the concept of a battle fought for land, resources, or simple conquest was almost beside the point. They perfected a form of combat so unique in human history that it seems to defy all rational military logic, the Xochitl or Flower War. These were not chaotic clashes of annihilation but meticulously arranged ritual battles, pre-negotiated with rival city-states like Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco, and conducted on a predetermined date at a sacred battlefield. The objective was singular and absolute, to capture prisoners, not to kill them or claim territory. These wars were a sacred harvesting of human beings, a grim and necessary solution to an unending divine demand for blood. The primary driver was religious. The Aztec worldview held that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the sun and set it in motion. To pay this cosmic debt and prevent the sun from stalling and the universe from ending, the gods required perpetual nourishment in the form of human hearts. The constant industrial-scale sacrifices at the Great Pyramid created an insatiable demand for victims. While criminals, slaves, and debtors could supply some, the most prized offerings were enemy warriors whose strong tonality or life force was considered the most potent sustenance for the gods. The Flower War became the primary and most honorable means of acquiring this sacred currency, turning the battlefield into a divine procurement ground. But the purpose was multifaceted, extending far beyond the spiritual. For the Aztec state, these ritualized conflicts were an essential military training program. They provided a live fire exercise for young, inexperienced warriors, a place to hone their skills and prove their courage without the high-stakes risk of a true war of conquest. A warrior's status was measured not by how many enemies he killed, but by how many he captured alive using specialized bladed clubs designed to maim and disable rather than kill. Bringing a worthy captive back to Tenochtitlan was the ultimate act of bravery, the fastest path to earning prestigious military ranks, lavish gifts from the emperor, and the right to wear specific feathered uniforms and insignia. The Flower War was a brutally efficient meritocracy, creating a fiercely motivated warrior class. Politically, these arranged battles served as a brilliant, if sinister, instrument of imperial control. The Aztec Triple Alliance, led by Tenochtitlan, was a hegemonic empire that often allowed rival states to retain a degree of autonomy, provided they submitted and paid tribute. The Flower War system was a pressure valve and a demonstration of power. By engaging in these perpetual ritual conflicts with unconquered but encircled enemies like Tlaxcala, the Aztecs kept these rival states militarily occupied and psychologically contained. They could showcase their martial superiority, continuously thin the enemy's ranks by taking their best warriors, and prevent these powerful entities from forming a broader coalition against them, all while maintaining a steady supply of sacrifices. It was a form of controlled, managed aggression that sustained the empire's spiritual and political engine. For the warriors on the other side, particularly the Tlaxcalans, the Flower War presented a complex and horrifying dilemma. They knew the grim fate that awaited any comrade captured on the battlefield, yet they continued to agree to these fights. Their reasons were a mix of honor, desperation, and cultural alignment. To refuse a challenge to a flower war would be a profound dishonor, a public admission of cowardice. Furthermore, it offered their own young warriors a chance to gain glory and capture Aztec warriors for their own, smaller-scale sacrificial rites. They were trapped in a deadly cycle, perpetuating a system that was slowly bleeding them dry because the cultural and spiritual rules of their world demanded it. This created a seething, pent-up hatred that would later prove to be the Aztec Empire's undoing. When Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors arrived, the desperate Tlaxcalans saw an opportunity to break the cycle, immediately allying with the newcomers against their ancient oppressors. The very ritual that had sustained Aztec power for a century had bred the perfect allies for its eventual destruction. Yet the complex relationship between survival and sacrifice extended even to those who had lived the longest in some of the world's harshest environments. For nomadic peoples like the Inuit of the Arctic or certain Siberian tribes, the relentless challenge of scarcity and the constant need for mobility created a heartbreaking social imperative. When an elder became too frail to travel, or when food was so scarce that the survival of the entire group was threatened, a practice known as Cannibalism, or the abandonment of the elderly, was sometimes employed. To our modern sensibilities, this is an unthinkable act of cruelty, the ultimate abandonment of those who cared for us. But for these communities, it was a devastatingly pragmatic and often deeply ritualized decision, born not from a lack of love, but from an overabundance of necessity. The primary drivers were brutally practical. In the endless, frozen landscape of the tundra, every mouthful of food was a precious commodity. A hunting party might travel for days and return with only enough seal or caribou to sustain the healthy adults and children who were essential for the group's future. An elder who could no longer contribute to hunting, sowing, or other vital tasks became, in the cruelest calculus of survival, a net drain on desperately limited resources. Furthermore, the nomadic lifestyle demanded constant movement to follow migrating herds. Transporting a completely infirm person across icy terrain on a dog sled or by foot was often physically impossible and would slow the entire group down, potentially exposing everyone to starvation or death in a sudden storm. The choice was thus framed not as an individual family's decision, but as a collective responsibility for the greater good of the band. The sacrifice of one, however painful, ensured the survival of the many. But this act was never as simple as coldly leaving someone behind. It was enveloped in cultural narratives and rituals that transformed it from an act of desperation into a voluntary sacrifice, a final, dignified gift from the elder to their community. Among the Inuit, an elder who felt they were becoming a burden might themselves suggest it was time to go to the ice. This was seen as the ultimate act of selflessness and love, a conscious decision to stop consuming food that could go to a grandchild or to prevent their family from risking their lives in a futile attempt to transport them. The process was often ritualized. The family would build the elder a small, temporary shelter or leave them in a known fishing spot with a final meal and a warm sealskin blanket. They would say their goodbyes, expressing not anger or resentment, but profound gratitude for the person's life and their ultimate sacrifice. In this cultural context, to refuse this final wish was seen as deeply selfish, forcing the elder to live with the shame of being a burden and jeopardizing the entire family. We see similar practices reflected in the ancient Greek world through the power of myth. The legend of the Senex Verpus, or the Old Man on the Mountain, tells of a custom on the island of Chios where men who reached the age of 60 were expected to drink hemlock in a ceremonial suicide. While historians debate whether this was ever actual widespread practice or more of a moral parable, the story itself reveals an ancient grappling with the same difficult questions of aging and resources. The myth suggests a society so concerned with maintaining its vigor and resources that it institutionalized the end of life, framing it as a noble duty to make way for the next generation. This starkly contrasts with other ancient societies that venerated their elders as repositories of wisdom and oral history, highlighting how geography and resource pressure created vastly different cultural solutions to the universal problem of aging. Our modern perspective, shaped by abundant resources, advanced medicine, and fixed living arrangements, rightly recoils at these practices. We have built entire ethical and legal frameworks around the concepts of elder care and the sanctity of life, viewing such acts through the lens of abandonment and abuse. However, to judge these ancient peoples by our standards is to misunderstand them completely. They were not monsters, they were human beings making impossible choices in a world without a safety net. Their actions were a tragic testament to the raw power of the survival instinct, channeled through a cultural lens that sought Chinese letter dignity to the undignifiable. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. In a life or death scenario where every calorie counts and movement means survival, what would we be capable of? The practices of these northern cultures stand as a somber reminder that our cherished morals are often a luxury afforded by stability, and that the line between sacrifice and survival can be terrifyingly thin. But the sheer scale and frequency of such offerings could escalate to almost unimaginable levels, transforming entire religious ceremonies into vast, organized operations of ritual slaughter. This was the world of institutionalized animal sacrifice, a practice so central to ancient religions that the air around major temples would have been permanently heavy with the scent of smoke, incense, and blood. From the summit of Mount Olympus to the inner court of the temple in Jerusalem, the relationship between humanity and the divine was negotiated across countless stone altars, with the lives of animals serving as the primary currency. In the ancient Greek world, the most spectacular expression of this was the hecatomb, a term derived from the words hekaton, meaning 100, and bous, meaning ox. As the name implies, this was a sacrifice of 100 cattle, an act of such immense expense and logistical complexity that it was typically reserved for the most significant state occasions, to celebrate a major military victory, to appease the gods during a plague, or to mark a crucial festival. The process was a grand public spectacle. The chosen oxen, their horns often gilded with gold, would be led in a magnificent procession to the altar. There, the presiding priest would make the initial cut, sprinkling barley grains on the animals' heads before a swift blow from an axe or mallet. The animals were then skillfully butchered. The thigh bones, wrapped in fat, were burned atop the altar as the portion dedicated to the gods, the rich smoke believed to rise to Olympus as a nourishing feast for the deities. The meat from the sacrifice, however, was rarely wasted. It was cooked and distributed among the entire community in a massive public feast, ensuring that even the poorest citizens shared in the divine blessing. A hecatomb was thus more than a ritual. It was a powerful economic engine, a social leveler, and a stunning display of a city-state's wealth and piety, all rolled into one. This practice found its most detailed and regulated form within ancient Judaism at the Temple in Jerusalem. The Book of Leviticus outlines a complex system of korbanot, or sacrificial offerings, each with a specific purpose and procedure. There were sacrifices for atonement of sin, like the chatat and the asham, sacrifices of thanksgiving and peace, the shelomim, and daily burnt offerings, the tamid, which involved a lamb sacrificed each morning and evening on behalf of the entire nation. The scale was staggering, particularly during the three major pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, when the population of Jerusalem would swell with hundreds of thousands of devout Jews. During Passover alone, historians like Josephus estimate that 250,000 lambs could be sacrificed in just a few days. The logistics were a marvel of ancient engineering and coordination. A virtual army of priests, the Kohanim, worked in shifts, their white linen robes often stained crimson. They moved with practiced efficiency, flaying the animals, salting the pieces to draw out the blood, a substance strictly forbidden for consumption, and placing the designated parts on the altar's fire. The resulting smoke created a perpetual column rising above the city, a constant visual and olfactory reminder of the covenant between God and his people. For the Romans, sacrifice was the fundamental act of Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Maintaining this peace was the cornerstone of the state's security and prosperity, and no major public event, a military campaign, a senatorial meeting, the inauguration of a consul, could begin without first consulting the gods through the art of haruspicy. This form of divination involved the sacrifice of a specially chosen animal, often a sheep or ox. After the animal was slain, a haruspex, a trained priest, would meticulously examine its internal organs, particularly the liver. The size, shape, color, and any unusual markings on the liver were believed to be a direct message from the gods. A smooth, healthy liver signified divine approval, while a diseased or malformed one could postpone a battle or derail an entire political agenda. The entire Roman Empire, with its vast armies and complex bureaucracy, quite literally operated on the readings from these slaughtered animals. The smell of burning flesh and the sight of blood-soaked altars were not considered unpleasant or barbaric. They were the very aroma of piety, the visible proof that the state was fulfilling its duty to the gods. This practice was so ingrained that early Christians were persecuted in part because their refusal to participate in a simple public sacrifice was seen as seditious, a direct threat to the spiritual and therefore political stability of Rome itself. The economic impact of this unending demand for sacrificial animals was profound. It created entire industries dedicated to breeding, raising, and transporting livestock that met strict ritual criteria. In Greece, cattle were a primary measure of wealth, their value directly tied to their religious purpose. Near Jerusalem, the fields of Bethlehem were essentially the first-century equivalent of a factory farm, producing a continuous supply of unblemished lambs certified kosher for temple use. Money changers and merchants set up shop in the temple's outer court to facilitate pilgrims needing to purchase an approved animal or convert their foreign currency, a practice that would later be famously condemned. The sheer volume of blood and waste generated required sophisticated infrastructure. The Temple Mount was engineered with a complex system of drains and channels to wash away the incredible amounts of blood and water used in the purification processes. This was not a messy side effect of faith. It was a calculated, industrial-scale operation that fused deep spirituality with the gritty realities of commerce, logistics, and public health, demonstrating that in the ancient world, pleasing the gods was the most important business of all. In the pantheon of ancient religious fervor, few acts were as extreme or as permanent as ritual castration, a practice that sought to transcend earthly gender and achieve a state of pure, divine devotion. Nowhere was this more vividly expressed than in the cult of the Magna Mater, or Great Mother, the goddess Cybele, whose worship was imported to Rome from Phrygia in Asia Minor around 204 BCE during the desperate throes of the Second Punic War. The Romans, hoping her favor would turn the tide against Hannibal, welcomed the goddess but were immediately unsettled by her most devout priests, the Galli. These were not ordinary clergy, they were men who had performed an act of ultimate sacrifice in a state of ecstatic frenzy. They had castrated themselves in honor of the goddess. The ritual itself was a public spectacle of blood and fervor, typically performed during the Day of Blood, the climax of the week-long festival of Megalesia each spring. To the rhythmic, driving beat of drums, flutes, and clashing cymbals, the Galli would work themselves into a frenzied trance through wild, spinning dances. Whipped into a divine madness, they would then take a ritual blade or a sharp piece of pottery and, in front of the roaring crowd, emasculate themselves in a single, brutal act. The severed organs were then ritually thrown onto the statue of the goddess or her altar, a grisly offering meant to symbolize the castration of Cybele's own consort, the god Attis, who according to myth performed the act upon himself in a fit of divine madness and remorse. For the Galli, this wasn't an act of self-mutilation but one of spiritual rebirth. By removing their masculinity, they believed they were shedding their earthly, physical identity to become wholly sacred, living vessels of the goddess's power, existing in a liminal state between male and female. They would thereafter dress in women's clothing, wear their hair long, and speak in high-pitched voices, their entire being a testament to their devotion. This act was believed to be the ultimate conduit for ensuring the fertility of the land and the people. The Galli's sacrifice of their own procreative power was a sympathetic offering, a magical transaction meant to guarantee the earth's bounty would be renewed. They were seen as powerful, numinous figures capable of offering prophecies and blessings, and they would travel through the streets begging for alms, their sacred status compelling donations. Yet, despite their vital spiritual role, their place in Roman society was profoundly paradoxical. While the Roman state officially sanctioned and funded the cult of Cybele, Roman citizens themselves were legally forbidden from becoming Galli. The act of castration was viewed with a mixture of awe, fascination, and deep-seated horror by the pragmatic Romans, who saw it as a dangerous Eastern excess. The Galli were therefore both revered and stigmatized, sacred yet socially outcast, living reminders of a spiritual extremity that the Roman mind could never fully embrace. This concept of sacred emasculation was not confined to the Mediterranean. A strikingly similar tradition exists in India with the Hera community, whose origins can be traced back thousands of years to references in ancient texts like the Kama Sutra and the epic Mahabharata. Like the Galli, Heras are devotees of a mother goddess, often Bahachara Mata, and many undergo a ritual emasculation ceremony they call Nirvan or rebirth. This act is seen as an offering to the goddess, removing their male sexuality to allow them to channel her divine power and bestow fertility blessings upon others. Historically, they held respected positions as performers and ritual specialists at ceremonies like births and weddings, their presence considered essential for invoking good fortune. Yet, much like the Galli, their societal position is complex, often straddling the line between reverence for their spiritual role and marginalization due to their deviation from social norms. The physical and social consequences of this choice were, and are, utterly permanent. Beyond the obvious medical risks of infection and hemorrhage from the crude procedure itself, these individuals faced a lifetime of biological change, including the loss of libido, the softening of features, and often the need to rely on outside sources like hormones in modern contexts to maintain their feminine presentation. Socially, they were set apart forever, unable to return to the lives they once knew. They forged new identities and found community solely with others who had made the same sacrifice, creating insular societies bound by shared ritual and experience. This voluntary renunciation of one's place in the traditional social and biological order stands as one of history's most powerful testaments to the lengths of human devotion, a chilling and awe-inspiring demonstration of the belief that to truly connect with the divine, one must first sever the most fundamental ties to the physical self. This profound connection between a ruler's life force and the prosperity of his entire kingdom gave rise to one of history's most startling political and spiritual traditions, the ritual killing of the king himself. Across several ancient cultures, the monarch was not merely a political leader but the living embodiment of the land, a divine vessel whose physical vigor was directly tied to the fertility of the soil, the abundance of the harvest, and the fortune of the people. When his power waned, whether through age, illness, or a simple downturn in the nation's luck, the logical and indeed sacred solution was to sacrifice him, transferring that divine essence to a younger, more vigorous successor to ensure the cycle of life continued. This practice, known as ritual regicide, represents the ultimate expression of divine kingship, where the crown was not a symbol of privilege but a sentence of eventual death. Some of the most documented evidence for this comes from the Mesopotamian world, where the king was seen as the spouse of the goddess Inanna. During the annual Akitu festival, a sacred marriage rite was performed to ensure fertility. While the historical record is debated, some scholars like Sir James George Fraser in his seminal work, The Golden Bough, pointed to legends suggesting that in a far more ancient, primordial time, this ritual may have ended not with symbolic union but with the actual death of the king, fulfilling his role as the goddess's consort by literally giving his life for the land. This idea of a dying and rising god-king is a powerful undercurrent in the region's mythology. We find a more concrete and chilling example in the customs of certain African kingdoms. The Shilluk people of the White Nile in Sudan practiced a form of ritual regicide well into the 19th century. Their king, or Reth, was considered a semi-divine incarnation of the culture hero Nikang, his spirit the very source of the kingdom's health. He was treated with immense reverence but also watched closely for any sign of physical decay, a serious illness, a wound that wouldn't heal, or even just the natural feebleness of old age. The moment the elders and priests decided his strength was failing, they would execute him, usually by suffocation or sealing him in a hut to die. This was not an act of rebellion or malice, but a solemn religious duty. The king's death was a necessary catalyst for renewal, allowing his spirit to be immediately reborn in a young, healthy successor, thus guaranteeing the continued vitality of the people and their crops. This concept of a temporary, sacrificial ruler is echoed in the Roman festival of Saturnalia. For a few days in December, the normal social order was turned completely upside down. Slaves could order their masters about, gambling was permitted in public, and a mock king was chosen from among the lowliest citizens or slaves. This king of Saturnalia was given temporary authority to command silly, frivolous acts from the revelers. However, at the end of the festival, this carnival monarch was expected to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the true Roman state. He was ritually executed. While this later evolved into a symbolic act, its origins likely harken back to a much older, far darker tradition of using a temporary scapegoat figure to absorb all the misfortunes and spiritual stagnation of the past year before being destroyed, thereby purifying the community and allowing the new year to begin afresh. Even the fierce Celts, as reported by classical authors, displayed traces of this belief in the sacred tie between the ruler and the land. Some accounts suggest that the reign of a Celtic chieftain was tied to his physical perfection and the prosperity he brought. A string of military defeats, a failed harvest, or a visible injury could be interpreted as a sign that the gods had withdrawn their favor, rendering the king ritually unclean and incapable of fulfilling his divine contract. In such cases, he could be replaced not through a simple coup, but through a ritual act that returned his life force to the earth, making way for a more worthy candidate. The king's body, in a sense, was not his own. It was the property of the tribe, a battery of spiritual power that had to be maintained at all costs. Over centuries, as societies grew more complex and the idea of a stable, hereditary monarchy took hold, the practice of actual regicide became politically untenable. It was gradually replaced by symbolic substitutes. The king didn't have to die. A substitute could die in his place. This is the likely origin of the scapegoat ritual found in numerous cultures, where an animal or a human criminal, often referred to as a pharmakos in ancient Greece, was ritually burdened with the sins and weaknesses of the community before being driven out or killed. Another evolution was the practice of ceremonial humiliation. There are accounts from ancient India of a ritual during the Ashvamedh, a horse sacrifice where the queen would engage in a symbolic, ritualized coupling with the dead horse, and the king would be ritually mocked and insulted by the priest. This verbal abuse and mockery served as a symbolic stripping away of his royal power, a cathartic release that allowed him to be spiritually renewed and recrowned without any actual harm coming to him. The king's symbolic death and rebirth became enough to satisfy the ancient bargain, allowing the crown to endure even as the fragile man who wore it eventually passed naturally from old age. While the sacrifice of kings and warriors sought to nourish the gods through blood, another set of rituals focused on extracting something equally vital through prolonged suffering, the practice of ritualized torture. This was not merely punishment, it was a carefully staged theater of agony designed to serve divine will, judicial authority, and political terror in equal measure. In the ancient world, pain was a language, and its most fluent speakers were often the very powers tasked with maintaining cosmic and social order. The Aztecs elevated this gruesome artistry to a central tenet of their faith, particularly in the worship of Tziptotec, our Lord the Flayed One. This god of agriculture, renewal, and the seasonal cycle was depicted wearing the freshly removed skin of a human victim, a grisly symbol of the new skin that covers the earth each spring. To honor him, priests would select a captive, often a warrior of renown, for a very specific fate. The victim would be fastened to a wooden framework and carefully shot with arrows in a manner that caused maximal blood loss without immediate death, their lifeblood soaking into the earth to fertilize it. In the most direct tribute to Tziptotec, some victims were instead ritually slain and then completely flayed. A priest would then don the dripping, entire skin of the deceased and wear it for 20 days as a living representation of the god, the rotting garment symbolizing the decaying husk of the old season that gives way to new growth. The psychological impact was profound. For the Aztecs, this was a powerful, if horrifying, lesson in regeneration. For the victims' community, it was a terrifying display of their captor's power and divine mandate, demonstrating that even in victory, their finest warriors could be transformed into literal vessels for the enemy's gods. Across the ocean, the Roman Empire perfected torture not for divine favor, but for judicial certainty and public deterrence. In the Roman legal system, torture, or quaestio, was a standard procedure, but its application was starkly divided along class lines. It was primarily reserved for non-citizens, slaves, and the lower classes, as the evidence obtained from a citizen under torture was not considered legally admissible. The most common purpose was to extract confessions or testimony from slaves, who were believed to be inherently duplicitous and would only tell the truth under extreme duress. The methods were systematic and brutal. The Aculeus or torture horse stretched joints to their breaking point, metal claws tore flesh, and burning plates were applied to the body. This was not done in shadowy dungeons, but often in public or during trial proceedings, a clear performance of the state's absolute power over the bodies of those it deemed beneath full legal protection. The public executions that followed a conviction were even more spectacularly cruel. Crucifixion was designed to maximize shame and prolonged suffering, while those convicted of parricide, the killing of a parent, were subjected to the pona cullae, being sewn into a leather sack with a live dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, and then thrown into the river. These acts were public spectacles, reinforcing the social hierarchy by graphically illustrating the catastrophic consequences of challenging the established order, from the divine right of the emperor down to the sanctity of the family unit. Other cultures employed torture as a tool of sheer psychological warfare, aiming to break the spirit of entire populations. The Assyrians were masters of this dark craft, using monumental art and royal inscriptions to boast of their cruelty and ensure their reputation preceded them. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Esarhaddon left behind detailed reliefs and texts describing their treatment of rebels, impalement on sharp stakes outside conquered cities, flaying victims alive and draping their skin over the city walls and dismemberment. These acts were not just punishments, they were strategic messages. A city considering rebellion would hear tales of what happened to the last group that defied the Assyrian king, and the psychological terror often proved more effective than any army at securing compliance. The public nature of the torture was key. It was a form of state-sponsored terrorism designed to paralyze enemies with fear long before the first arrow was ever loosed. This intertwining of pain and power reveals a universal ancient truth. Control over the human body was the ultimate expression of authority. Whether to please a god believed to wear human skin, to extract a legally admissible truth from a slave, or to terrorize a rival kingdom into submission, the deliberate infliction of agony was a calculated tool. It served to delineate the sacred from the profane, the citizen from the slave, the powerful from the powerless. These rituals of pain affirmed a social and cosmic order built on the absolute subjugation of the individual, a stark reminder that in the ancient world, the line between the divine and the monstrous was often drawn in blood and screamed in agony. But beyond the display of power through the agony of others, ancient peoples also sought connection and power through the veneration of those who had already passed into the next world, transforming the remains of the dead into objects of profound spiritual significance. While we often think of ancestor worship as a quiet, respectful practice, its ancient forms were far more physical and intimate, involving a hands-on relationship with the bones of the departed that would be unthinkable in most cultures today. This was not a metaphor, it was a literal belief that the skulls and bones of one's forebears retained a potent life force, a tangible link to the other side that could be harnessed for the benefit of the living. Some of the earliest evidence for this comes from the Neolithic Near East, around 9,000 years ago at sites like Jericho. Here, archaeologists made a startling discovery. Beneath the floors of homes, they found human skulls that had been meticulously separated from their bodies and treated with a layer of plaster, carefully molded to recreate the face of the deceased. Shells were inset for eyes, and paint was used to add details like hair and distinctive facial markings. These were not hidden away but were likely displayed in the home, serving as powerful, three-dimensional portraits of revered family members or community leaders. This practice, often called a skull cult, suggests a deep desire to keep the presence of the ancestors physically embedded within the daily life of the community. The plastered skull wasn't a macabre trophy, it was a vessel. It was believed that by preserving the skull, the container of the mind, the soul, and identity, the family could maintain a direct line of communication with the ancestor, seeking their guidance, protection, and blessing for the harvest. The home itself became a place where the living and the dead coexisted, with the skull acting as a conduit for spiritual power and a constant reminder of the family's lineage. This profound need to maintain a physical connection took an even more direct form in the highland valleys of Papua New Guinea among groups like the Anga people. Here, the practice of ancestor veneration involved a complex process of mummification. Unlike the elaborate Egyptian methods of desiccation and wrapping, the Anga method was more elemental. The body was placed on a wooden platform in a sheltered cave or a specialized hut, where smoke from a constantly tended fire would slowly cure and preserve the remains over many months. The result was a completely desiccated but intact ancestor who was then decorated with ochre paint, shells, and elaborate headdresses. These mummies were not interred. They were brought out during important ceremonies, propped up to watch over rituals, and consulted for advice. In a very real sense, the ancestor remained a participating member of the tribe, their withered form a visible anchor for their enduring spirit, ensuring their wisdom continued to guide the community long after their death. The manipulation of bones often went beyond display and into the realm of consumption, blurring the line between veneration and what we would term cannibalism. For some cultures, the ultimate act of respect and spiritual unity was to literally incorporate the ancestor into oneself. There is strong archaeological and ethnographic evidence from various parts of the world, including certain Amazonian tribes and prehistoric European groups, suggesting that endocannibalism, the consumption of flesh from within one's own group, was practiced as a form of mortuary ritual. The logic was one of reverence, not hunger. By consuming the flesh of a deceased loved one, particularly a great leader or shaman, the community believed they were absorbing their wisdom, strength, and vital essence, preventing those qualities from being lost to the earth and ensuring the ancestor's spirit would live on within the tribe itself. It was the most intimate form of remembrance imaginable, a belief that the boundary between the living and the dead was not absolute but something that could be transcended through a sacred, somatic act. As societies grew larger and more complex, these intensely physical practices gradually gave way to more symbolic forms of worship. The transition can be seen in the development of ancient Roman practices. Early Roman lairs, the protective household gods, were likely once the deified spirits of specific ancestors whose skulls or ashes were kept in the home. Over time, these were abstracted into small statues representing the guardians of the hearth and family. The bones were no longer necessary, their spirit could be invoked through a symbol. Similarly, in Imperial China, the elaborate practice of venerating engraved ancestral tablets on family altars replaced older, more direct interactions with physical remains. The offering of food, incense, and prayers became a symbolic act of sustaining the ancestor's spirit in the afterlife, a ritual that maintained the connection without the need to handle the body itself. This evolution reflects a broader shift in human spirituality, moving from a worldview where the sacred was immediately present in the physical matter of bone and flesh to one where it could be accessed through ritual, symbol, and faith, creating a new kind of distance between the living and the dead, even as the desire for their guidance remained as strong as ever. While the physical manipulation of remains sought to connect with ancestral spirits, other ancient traditions pursued communion with the divine by deliberately altering the very fabric of human consciousness. Across the globe and throughout history, cultures turned to the powerful effects of psychoactive plants and potions, not for recreation, but as sacred technologies to tear down the veil between worlds and access realms of knowledge and vision normally hidden from mortal sight. This ritual drug use was a controlled, revered practice, a far cry from modern prohibitions, viewed instead as a necessary key for unlocking the deepest mysteries of existence. Perhaps the most famous and enigmatic example comes from ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries. For nearly 2,000 years, from around the 15th century BCE to the 4th century CE, this was the most sacred religious rite in the Hellenic world. Initiates, who included everyone from slaves to emperors like Marcus Aurelius, underwent a profound days-long ceremony in the city of Eleusis, culminating in a powerful visionary experience that promised to eliminate the fear of death and reveal the secret of a blissful afterlife. The central agent of this transformation is believed to have been a special potion called kykeon. While the exact recipe was a fiercely guarded secret, modern scholars like ethnobotanists Albert Hoffman and R. Gordon Wasson have proposed a compelling theory. They suggest the kykeon was infused with ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains lysergic acid amines, chemical cousins to LSD. Consuming this concoction would have induced powerful visual and auditory hallucinations, a sense of unity with the divine and ego dissolution, an experience perfectly aligning with ancient descriptions of the mystery's climax. This was not a chaotic trip, it was a carefully orchestrated sacrament. The entire ritual, from the fasting and procession from Athens to the symbolic reenactment of the myth of Demeter and Persephone, served as a set and setting designed to guide the initiate through a spiritual rebirth. The experience was so profound that it was forbidden upon pain of death to ever reveal what transpired in the telesterion, the initiation hall. For the ancient world, this was the ultimate spiritual privilege, a state-sanctioned, divinely sanctioned journey into the psychedelic realm. Far to the north, on the vast Pontic Caspian steppe, the nomadic Scythians employed a very different substance for their sacred rites. The Greek historian Herodotus provides a vivid account of how these fierce warriors used cannabis in a ritual purification. He describes how they would erect small felt tents and throw hemp seeds onto red-hot stones placed inside a portable brazier. He writes, "The Scythians howl with joy in their vapor bath. This serves them instead of bathing, for they never wash their bodies with water." This inhalation of the thick, psychoactive smoke would have induced a powerful, trance-like state. Archaeological evidence stunningly confirms Herodotus's account. In a frozen Scythian burial mound at Pazyryk in Siberia, excavators found a small tent framework and a copper brazier still containing charred hemp seeds. For the Scythians, this was not merely a way to get high. The ritual was a form of spiritual cleansing before battle or burial, a way to achieve ecstatic communion with their gods and ancestors, and a method of divination to foresee the outcome of future events. The intense psychoactive experience was interpreted as traveling to the spirit world, returning with strength, wisdom, and prophetic visions essential for the survival of their nomadic culture. This shamanic tradition of using plant teachers to access spiritual realms finds its most profound and enduring expression in the Amazon rainforest with the brew known as ayahuasca. Used for millennia by indigenous peoples across Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador, ayahuasca is a masterful pharmacological achievement. It is a concoction typically made from the boiled Banisteriopsis copy vine, which contains MAO inhibitors, and the leaves of the Psychotria viridis plant, which contains the powerful psychedelic compound DMT. Ordinarily, DMT is broken down by stomach enzymes and has no effect when ingested orally. The MAO inhibitors in the vine prevent this, allowing the DMT to cross into the bloodstream and activate the brain's serotonin receptors, launching an hours-long journey of intense visionary experience. In the context of a ceremony led by a trained shaman or ayahuasquero, this journey is a sacred healing ritual. Participants drink the bitter brew and, under the guide's careful supervision and the protective icaros or healing songs, embark on an inward voyage. It is described not as a series of random hallucinations, but as a coherent encounter with a living intelligence within the plant, often personified as Mother Ayahuasca. The purpose is healing, diagnosis, and revelation. The experience often involves profound purging, both physical vomiting, which is seen as releasing emotional and spiritual toxins, and psychological catharsis, confronting traumas, fears, and negative patterns. Shamans use the brew to diagnose illnesses, see into the spiritual causes of imbalance, and retrieve lost soul parts. For these cultures, ayahuasca is not a drug in the modern, profane sense. It is a medicine, a teacher, and a sacred technology that provides direct access to the animistic spirit world that underpins reality. The societal acceptance is total within this context. The shaman is a respected, trained professional, and the brew is approached with utmost reverence, strict dietary preparations, and clear intentionality. This stands in stark contrast to the modern war on drugs, which often categorizes such potent substances as dangerous narcotics with no legitimate use, criminalizing ancient practices and dismissing their profound cultural and spiritual significance. The enduring power of these rituals reminds us that humanity's relationship with consciousness-altering substances is not a modern story of abuse, but an ancient and deeply rooted narrative of the human quest for healing, knowledge, and direct encounter with the divine. The roar of the crowd in the Roman amphitheater was not reserved for gladiators alone. Another form of mass spectacle shared the bloody sands, one that demonstrated humanity's power not over other men but over the entire natural world. The Venations, or wild beast hunts, were a staggering display of organized cruelty and logistical might, where the empire's boundless reach was made horrifyingly visible. Thousands upon thousands of animals, lions from North Africa, tigers from India, elephants from the Atlas Mountains, rhinoceroses from the Nile, and ostriches, bears, and crocodiles from every corner of the known world were captured, transported, and then systematically slaughtered in the arena for public delight. A single event under Emperor Titus to inaugurate the Colosseum saw the killing of 9,000 animals. For the launch of the theater of Marcellus, the butchery claimed a scarcely believable 11,000 creatures. This was not hunting, it was industrial-scale extermination as public entertainment, a visceral demonstration that Rome could not only conquer foreign peoples but could also bring the most exotic and powerful beasts of the earth to their knees for sport. The underlying message was one of absolute dominance. By parading and then destroying the fiercest predators from every conquered province, Rome was symbolically taming the wild, untamed chaos of nature itself, reinforcing the idea that the civilized, ordered world of the empire held sway over all. The Venatio was a potent metaphor for imperial control, a dramatic assertion that there was no force, human or animal, that could withstand the might of Rome. The man in charge of this carnage was the editor, the sponsor of the games, who used the spectacle to gain political favor. For the citizens, it was a thrilling, often free, form of entertainment and a source of free meat. The carcasses of the slain herbivores were often butchered and distributed to the crowd. Yet the religious roots of this practice ran deep, harking back to much older traditions where the ritual killing of an animal was not for sport, but for divine favor. This spiritual dimension finds its purest expression in the mysterious cult of Mithras, a salvation religion popular among Roman soldiers. Central to its secret initiation rites was the tauroctony, a sacred scene depicting the god Mithras in the act of slaying a bull. This was far more than a simple image of hunting. It was a dense cosmic symbol. Every element of the scene was astrologically coded. The bull was associated with the constellation Taurus, the scorpion that often nips at its testicles with Scorpio, the dog with Canis Minor, and the snake with Hydra. Mithras himself was linked to Perseus. The act of sacrifice was believed to be a reenactment of a primordial event that brought about the creation of the world. The dying bull's blood was seen as the source of all life on Earth, fertilizing the soil and generating the moon cycles and the plants that sustain humanity. By participating in this symbolic sacrifice, initiates believed they were aligning themselves with the cosmic order and securing their own soul's journey through the celestial spheres after death. The Mithraic ritual was a stark contrast to the public chaos of the Venatians, a closed, solemn, and deeply symbolic act of violence charged with the weight of cosmic renewal. This belief that the ritualized death of an animal could ensure future hunting success or agricultural abundance is a thread that runs through countless ancient cultures. For prehistoric hunter-gatherers, the relationship with prey was not one of simple exploitation but of profound spiritual reciprocity. Cave paintings in places like Lascaux, which depict animals with spears and traps, are now interpreted by many anthropologists not as hunting manuals but as part of shamanistic rituals. By symbolically mastering the animal in art, the hunter believed they could influence the outcome of the real hunt, appeasing the spirit of the species to grant success and ensure the animal's return in future seasons. The act of killing was followed by rituals of respect and atonement. Some Siberian and North American indigenous tribes would offer prayers or apologies to the spirit of the bear or buffalo they had slain, and would carefully dispose of its bones in a ceremonial manner to allow its spirit to be reborn and return to be hunted again. The kill was part of a sacred cycle of death and regeneration, a necessary act for survival that was tempered with reverence. The scale of what happened in Rome, however, severed this ancient connection. The Venetians were not about reciprocity or survival. They were about dominion, extravagance, and the sheer spectacle of power. The natural world was not a partner to be respected, but a resource to be plundered and an enemy to be vanquished for applause. The endless demand for new and exotic creatures to kill in ever more inventive ways led to local extinctions and immense suffering, a stark historical precedent for humanity's capacity for wanton ecological destruction. This shift from sacred hunting to ritualized cruelty marks a pivotal moment in our relationship with the animal kingdom, moving from a worldview of respectful interdependence to one of unquestioned dominance, a philosophy that would echo through the centuries and shape our modern environmental challenges. In the intricate social fabric of the ancient world, the institution of slavery was not an aberrant evil but a fundamental, deeply embedded thread, accepted as a natural and necessary part of the economic and religious order. To understand this, we must shed our modern conception of slavery, which is almost exclusively defined by the racialized chattel slavery of the early modern era. In antiquity, slavery was a multifaceted reality, a condition that could befall anyone through bad luck, war, or debt, and it was often justified and even administered by the gods themselves. The most common path into servitude was not through some distant raid, but through the simple, crushing weight of economic reality, debt. Across the ancient Near East, in the law codes of Mesopotamia like those of Hammurabi, debt slavery was a standard legal practice. A farmer who could not repay a loan of grain or silver, perhaps after a poor harvest, faced a dire choice. He could sell himself, his wife, or his children into servitude to the creditor to work off the debt. This was not meant to be a permanent state. Most law codes, including Hammurabi's, stipulated a maximum term of service, often 3 years, after which the debt slave was to be released. In theory, this was a form of contract labor, a social safety net that prevented total destitution by offering one's labor as collateral. In practice, however, the power dynamics were so overwhelmingly tilted toward the creditor that it often became a life sentence. The debt could be manipulated, terms extended, and conditions made so harsh that release was a distant dream. The family unit, the core of society, could be legally dismantled to settle a ledger, a concept that underscores the starkly different value placed on individual liberty in the ancient economy. Beyond the private debts between citizens, slavery was a direct function of state power and religious duty. The engine that drove the slave markets of the ancient world was warfare. A city or tribe that lost a conflict could expect its entire population to be enslaved en masse by the victors. The famous Roman general and dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, after putting down a rebellion in Italy, took so many captives that the price of slaves in the markets of Rome reportedly plummeted due to the massive surplus. But even more fascinating is the concept of sacred slavery. In Mesopotamia and Anatolia, temples were not just places of worship. They were massive economic enterprises owning vast tracts of land, herds of livestock, and workshops. To manage this divine wealth, they employed a huge class of temple slaves who were considered the property of the god or goddess. These individuals performed every task from cleaning and maintaining the sanctuary to crafting ritual objects and managing the temple's accounts. Their condition was not necessarily one of abject misery. As servants of the divine, they enjoyed a certain protected status and were often better provided for than slaves in private hands. Yet they were still property, their lives dedicated irrevocably to a celestial master. The experience of a slave varied wildly depending on their role. At the brutal end of the spectrum were those condemned to the mines or the great agricultural latifundia or plantations of Rome. Here, life was short, brutal, and anonymous. Workers, often branded for identification, would toil in chains under the whip until they died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or accident, their bodies easily replaced by the endless supply from Rome's conquests. In stark contrast, a slave in an urban household could live a life of relative comfort and even influence. A trusted secretary, a skilled tutor, or a clever financial manager could become an indispensable part of a wealthy Roman family's daily life. They could manage property, educate the children, and enjoy a degree of personal autonomy. Some could even save their meager allowance, the peculium, to one day buy their freedom. Yet, this seemingly softer version of slavery was underpinned by a terrifying and absolute power dynamic. The Roman concept of dominica potestas granted the master the power of life and death over his slaves. He could punish, torture, or kill them with impunity for any reason, a right that was not legally challenged until the reign of the Emperor Augustus. The slave's body was not their own. It was an instrument for the master's will, a reality that could turn a comfortable existence into a nightmare on a whim. This widespread acceptance rested on a powerful ideological foundation. Greek philosophers like Aristotle provided the intellectual justification, formulating the theory of natural slavery. In his work Politics, he argues that some people are slaves by nature, lacking the capacity for rational thought necessary for full citizenship, and are therefore better off being ruled by their intellectual superiors. This idea provided a convenient moral cover, allowing the elite to view the entire system not as a cruel exploitation, but as a natural, even benevolent order. The gods, too, were invoked. Military victories that yielded thousands of slaves were seen as proof of divine favor, the captured enemies becoming living trophies of a god's power. To question the institution of slavery would have been to question the very structure of the cosmos, the will of the gods, and the wisdom of the greatest thinkers. It was as normal and unremarkable as the air they breathed, a stark reminder that the most profound moral blind spots are often those that are woven into the very fabric of what a society considers common sense. But even the most revered sources of divine wisdom were not immune to the corrupting influence of human ambition. Across the ancient world, the voices of the gods often spoke with a suspiciously convenient timing, guiding empires toward decisions that just so happened to benefit a wealthy patron or a powerful political faction. This brings us to the shadowy art of oracle manipulation, a practice where the divine will was subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, steered by earthly desires, revealing that the bridge between the mortal and the celestial was often built on a foundation of gold and guile. The most famous center for this sacred guidance was undoubtedly the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, this was the navel of the world, the place where the god Apollo was believed to speak directly to humanity through a possessed priestess, the Pythia. The process was awe-inspiring. A seeker, be it a common citizen or the emissary of a mighty king, would present a question and a rich gift to the temple priests. The Pythia would then descend into a sacred chamber, the Aditon, and sit atop a golden tripod. There, after drinking from a sacred spring and perhaps chewing laurel leaves, she would inhale strange vapors rising from a fissure in the rock floor, falling into a frenzied trance. Her guttural cries and unintelligible utterances were then interpreted and translated into poetic hexameter by the attending priests, who delivered the final, often ambiguous, prophecy to the waiting client. For centuries, the scientific explanation for the Pythia's trance was a matter of legend. However, late 20th century geological investigations of the site revealed something astonishing. The area is crossed by two fault lines, and the underlying limestone is rich in bituminous deposits. Researchers theorized that light, hydrocarbon gases like ethylene, which has sweet-smelling, neurotoxic, and trance-inducing properties, could have seeped from the fissure in the Aditon. This would mean the Pythia's divine possession had a very real pharmacological basis. But while the gases might have triggered her ecstatic state, they did not write the prophecies. This is where the human element of manipulation entered the picture. The priests of Apollo, the Hosioi, were not merely passive translators. They were highly educated, well-connected political operators who were masters at crafting the gods' pronouncements to serve a wider agenda. The most powerful tool in their arsenal was deliberate ambiguity. A classic example is the prophecy given to the wealthy King Croesus of Lydia before he attacked the Persian Empire. The oracle famously declared that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Interpreting this as a certain victory, Croesus launched his invasion only to be decisively defeated. The great empire he destroyed was his own. The prophecy was technically correct, yet utterly misleading. This vagueness provided the priests with perfect deniability regardless of the outcome, protecting the oracle's infallible reputation. They could also gather immense amounts of sensitive political and military intelligence from the stream of powerful visitors, giving them an unparalleled understanding of the Mediterranean world's shifting alliances and vulnerabilities. This knowledge allowed them to tailor their advice in ways that would maximize their own temple's prestige, wealth, and political influence. There is also strong historical suspicion of outright bribery. The temple amassed incredible riches from its offerings, and it is not difficult to imagine a wealthy state or individual making an additional, private donation to ensure a favorable prophecy. When the Athenians sought guidance before the Persian invasion, the oracle initially delivered a terrifying prophecy of doom, prophesying that wooden walls alone would not protect them. After a second, more generous delegation was sent, the priests provided a more nuanced interpretation, suggesting the wooden walls referred to the Athenian navy, which then led to the victorious Battle of Salamis. Was this a genuine divine clarification, or a calculated shift after the priests assessed the strategic situation and the size of the Athenian offering? The line between divine inspiration and political calculation was beautifully and profitably blurred. This power to shape the destiny of nations was not confined to Greece. In ancient Egypt, the priests of Ammon at Thebes wielded such immense influence through oracles that they effectively became the kingmakers of the new kingdom. During the popular Festival of the Valley, a statue of the god Ammon was carried in a processional bark from Karnak Temple. The movement of the massive boat on the shoulders of the priests was interpreted as the god's will. By subtly controlling the movement of the bark, a feat easily achieved by the carriers, the priests could have the god approve or disapprove of a pharaoh's policy, a military campaign, or even a royal succession. This gave the temple a direct veto power over the state, making the pharaoh, the supposed living god, subservient to the very priests who served him. The divine will, in such cases, was quite literally carried out by men with their own interests and alliances. The sheer scale of the oracle's influence makes the few documented cases of suspected fraud all the more telling. The most famous scandal involved the Spartan king Cleomenes I in the late 6th century BCE. He was accused of bribing the Pythia to declare that his co-king, Demaratus, was illegitimate and thus unfit to rule, allowing Cleomenes to seize sole power. While the accusation was never definitively proven, it was widely believed and contributed to Cleomenes' later downfall. The very fact that such a prominent figure could be credibly accused of corrupting the oracle points to a widespread understanding that the system was, at least potentially, rigged. Yet the faithful kept coming. The perceived cost of ignoring the gods was simply too high, and the Delphic oracle's reputation for wisdom, however manufactured, remained largely intact for centuries. It was a perfect system, the mystery of the trance, the brilliance of the ambiguous poetry, and the immense political power of the priesthood combined to create an institution that was, for all intents and purposes, beyond reproach. To question the oracle was to question the gods themselves, a risk that few in the ancient world were willing to take. While the manipulation of oracles shows how the divine could be bent to human will, some ancient powers sought to make their own bloodlines literally divine, enforcing a practice that stands as one of history's ultimate taboos: ritualized royal incest. In most human societies, strict prohibitions against marrying close relatives are near universal, a cultural instinct often backed by the biological understanding of the dangers of inbreeding. Yet, for the god-kings of ancient Egypt, these rules were not just broken, they were institutionalized as a sacred duty. The most famous examples are the Ptolemaic pharaohs, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great, with Cleopatra VII famously marrying her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. But this tradition stretched back millennia to the native Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom and beyond. For them, marrying a sister wasn't a perversion. It was the pinnacle of religious and political strategy, a necessary act to preserve the pure, divine essence of the royal lineage. The driving force behind this was the concept of the pharaoh's divinity. He was not merely a ruler appointed by the gods, he was believed to be a living god himself, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky deity. His queen, therefore, had to be a vessel of equal purity. Who could possibly be a suitable match for a god other than another goddess? By marrying his sister, the pharaoh was emulating the very gods of the Egyptian pantheon, who themselves engaged in incestuous relationships. The prime example was Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who was married to his sister Isis. Their union was not just accepted but celebrated as the mythic foundation of kingship and rebirth. For a pharaoh to take a sister as his chief wife was to perform this divine drama on earth, reinforcing his own sacred status and ensuring the cosmic order, or Ma'at, remained intact. It was a continuous ritual, a marriage that was also a religious ceremony binding the royal family to the gods. Politically, the advantages were equally compelling. In a system where power was concentrated in one family, incest was the ultimate retention strategy. By marrying within the immediate family, the pharaoh prevented power from being diluted or challenged by ambitious outside nobles. There was no need to share prestige, wealth, or authority with a rival clan when your co-ruler was your own sibling. The royal family became a closed, self-perpetuating loop of authority. The title, King's Great Wife, held immense political power, and keeping that title within the innermost circle ensured that a queen's loyalty would be unquestionably to her brother-husband and their dynasty, not to any external family with its own agenda. This created a hyper-concentrated form of power, but it also made the royal family profoundly isolated, living in a divine bubble entirely separate from the social norms governing their subjects. For the common people of Egypt, however, the rules were completely different. Incestuous marriages were strictly forbidden and carried a terrible social stigma. Papyrus records from worker villages like Deir el-Medina show that ordinary Egyptians followed exogamous marriage practices, seeking partners from outside their immediate family to build alliances and strengthen community bonds. The stark difference in rules between the royalty and the populace highlights how this practice was never about morality in a universal sense. It was a tool of power, a special privilege that visually and legally set the ruling family apart as a different order of being entirely. They lived by the rules of the gods while the people lived by the rules of men. This model of royal incest was not unique to Egypt. Half a world away, the indigenous cultures of Hawaii developed a strikingly similar institution. There, the ali, or chiefly class, operated under the concept of pio, which translates to arching over like a rainbow. A pio marriage was the highest possible union between a brother and sister of the highest royal rank. The offspring of such a union were considered so supremely sacred, so saturated with mana or spiritual power, that they were above all other chiefs. Their divinity was such that commoners were required to prostrate themselves on the ground in their presence, as direct eye contact was believed to be dangerous. This practice, like in Egypt, was designed to concentrate and maximize divine power within a single lineage, creating a ruling class so elevated that their right to rule could never be questioned. It was a social and spiritual stratification engineered through controlled reproduction. The consequences of these closed genetic pools, however, were inevitably biological. While the full extent of genetic disorders in the Egyptian royal families is debated due to a lack of conclusive DNA evidence from key mummies, the Ptolemaic dynasty provides a telling case study. Centuries of sibling marriage resulted in a clear pattern of physical and possibly mental infirmities. The line famously ended with Cleopatra, who was actually the product of several generations of brother-sister marriages. While she herself was famously intelligent and charismatic, her predecessors showed signs of the genetic cost. Ptolemy VIII was notoriously obese and was cruelly nicknamed Potbelly. Other rulers within the dynasty were known for their extreme lethargy and lack of energy, potential symptoms of underlying hereditary health issues. The practice of keeping power within the family ultimately produced a weakened, genetically fragile line that collapsed shortly after Cleopatra's death, unable to withstand the external pressure of Rome. The very strategy designed to ensure eternal dynastic strength contained the seeds of its own eventual dissolution, a tragic irony where the quest for divine purity led to a mortal weakening. This practice of transferring a community's troubles onto a single, vulnerable individual finds one of its most formalized and chilling expressions in the ancient Greek ritual known as the pharmakos. In times of great crisis, a devastating plague, a famine, a military defeat, or any collective calamity that felt like the wrath of the gods, the city would turn to this solemn and brutal ceremony. The underlying belief was that the community had accumulated a miasma, a spiritual pollution or collective sin, that needed to be physically purged. The solution was not to examine their own actions, but to find a living vessel for all this negative energy and cast it out, thereby restoring balance and purity. The selection of the pharmakos was a process steeped in symbolism. The chosen individual was almost never a respected citizen. They were typically drawn from the lowest ranks of society: a convicted criminal, a physically deformed or disabled person, a beggar, or a social outcast. Their very existence on the margins of the community made them the perfect symbolic receptacle for the city's ills. In Athens, the chosen ones were even referred to as katharmata, literally meaning offscourings or filth, a dehumanizing term that made the act of expulsion easier to justify. These individuals were seen as human refuse, and their sacrifice was considered a necessary form of social and spiritual hygiene. The ceremony itself was a twisted mix of reverence and violence, a ritualized drama that played out in the public square. The selected scapegoat was first treated with a strange, paradoxical kindness. They were led through the city and symbolically fed the finest foods, cheese, barley, and figs at public expense. This act was not an act of compassion but a crucial part of the magic. By feeding the scapegoat, the community was quite literally loading all of its sins, misfortunes, and spiritual corruption into this human container. They were fattening him up with their collective guilt. Following this symbolic feeding came the cathartic release of violence. The pharmakos was then ritually beaten with fig branches and squills, a type of wild onion. The beating with specific plants was deeply symbolic. Fig wood was associated with fertility, and squills were believed to have apotropaic or evil-repelling properties. This wasn't just random brutality. Each strike was meant to drive the pollution out of the community and into the waiting vessel. The final act was the expulsion. The beaten and bloodied scapegoat was driven out of the city gates, beyond the boundary markers that separated the civilized world from the dangerous wilderness, and forbidden from returning. In some accounts, particularly from the island of Lesbos, the ritual did not end with exile but with death. the Farmakos were stoned to death by the community and their body burned, the ashes scattered to the winds to ensure the pollution was utterly annihilated. Whether through exile or execution, the result was the same. The city had been purified, the community, having projected all its fears and failings onto this one expendable person, could breathe a collective sigh of relief, believing they had successfully appeased the angry gods and averted further disaster. This concept of a burden-bearing scapegoat is a powerful archetype that appears in numerous ancient cultures, revealing a shared human impulse to externalize blame. A remarkably parallel ritual is described in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Leviticus. On the holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take 2 male goats. One would be sacrificed to the Lord on the altar. The other, the goat for Azazel, would become the focus of a powerful ceremony. The priest would lay his hands on the animal's head and confess all the sins of the people of Israel, thereby transferring them onto the goat. This laden creature was then not killed, but driven away into the wilderness, into the domain of the demonic entity Azazel, carrying the transgressions of the people into a desolate land where they could no longer harm the community. The psychological mechanism is identical to the Greek Farmakos. The sins of the many are magically transferred to the one, who is then removed, restoring a sense of order and cleanliness. We see echoes of this in Roman tradition as well. During times of extreme peril, such as a plague or a shocking omen, the Romans might perform a ver sacrum, or sacred spring, vowing to sacrifice everything born that spring to the gods if the crisis was averted. While this was typically applied to livestock, the underlying principle of offering a collective payment to appease divine anger is related. More directly, the practice of throwing symbolic effigies into the river during the festival of the Arge, or the occasional historical reports of live human offerings being buried in the Forum Boreum during the early Republic, suggest a similar, albeit rarer, urge to sacrifice a life to save the state. The enduring power of the scapegoat ritual lies in its grim psychological efficiency. It offers a simple, tangible solution to complex, intangible problems. It is far easier to identify a single source of contamination and remove it than it is to address the nuanced web of social, economic, and environmental factors that may have actually caused a famine or plague. The Farmakos provided a cathartic, collective action that reunited the community against a common enemy, reinforcing social bonds at the expense of a single, powerless individual. It is a dark chapter in human history, but one that holds up a mirror to a tendency we still grapple with today: the instinct to find a single source to blame for our shared misfortunes, to purge the unwanted elements, and to believe that by removing them we can somehow purify ourselves. Even the act of taking one's own life, the ultimate termination of the self, could be transformed in the ancient world from a desperate, private sin into a public, ritualized performance of honor, piety, and control. While modern society largely views suicide through a lens of mental health crisis and tragedy, numerous ancient cultures codified it as a noble, even obligatory, exit strategy for preserving one's dignity and serving a purpose greater than individual existence. This was not an act of despair, but a calculated, often ceremonial choice to dictate the terms of one's own end. The most iconic example of this is the Japanese practice of seppuku, also known by the more colloquial term harakiri. While its most famous instances occurred in the medieval and early modern eras, its philosophical and cultural roots reach deep into the ancient past, intertwining with the arrival of Buddhism and the development of the samurai code or bushido. Seppuku was far more than just suicide. It was an elaborate rite of self-purification and a means of taking full responsibility for one's actions. The ritual was designed to demonstrate the ultimate in self-discipline and courage. A samurai who faced defeat in battle, brought shame upon his lord, or failed in a critical duty was expected to perform seppuku to atone for his failure and restore his honor and that of his family. The actual physical act was gruesomely specific. The samurai would dress in white burial robes, compose a final death poem, and be seated on a white cloth. Before a gathered audience of witnesses, he would take a short blade, a tanto, plunge it into the left side of his abdomen, draw it across to the right, and then make a final upward cut. The agony involved was the entire point. It was the final, definitive proof of his unwavering spirit and samurai resolve. To cry out or show fear would negate the entire purpose. Often, a trusted comrade, the kaishakunin, would stand by to perform a swift decapitation the moment the cutting motion was complete, ending the suffering, but only after the act of self-disembowelment had been courageously initiated. This ritual transformed a moment of supreme personal failure into a final, controlled performance of the very virtues the samurai had failed to uphold in life. A similar ethos existed in the Roman world, where the phrase, falling on one's sword, was a literal and honorable course of action. For a Roman patrician or a disgraced commander, suicide was a preferable alternative to the shame of capture or the humiliation of a public execution. The most famous example is that of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who was ordered to take his own life by the Emperor Nero. Seneca calmly slit his wrists and ankles, but when his aged body proved resistant, he finally succumbed to poison, all while dictating his final thoughts to scribes. His death was a deliberate philosophical statement, a demonstration of the Stoic ideal that a wise man is free to choose his exit and should meet death with rational composure. For a military man like Marcus Brutus after his defeat at Philippi, falling on his own sword was the only acceptable end. It was an act that proclaimed he was the author of his own fate, not his enemy's prisoner. His death, like his life, was his own to command. This practice was so normalized that it was considered a privilege extended to high-status Romans. Common criminals and slaves were executed, but aristocrats were often given the opportunity to commit suicide privately, saving their family's reputation and their property from confiscation by the state. This concept of a religiously motivated death finds one of its most profound and enduring expressions in the Jain practice of Salikhana, or Santhara. This is not an act driven by shame or defeat, but by a radical, centuries-old spiritual undertaking. Salikhana is a final, extreme form of asceticism, a voluntary fasting to death undertaken by a Jain ascetic or devout layperson when they feel death is naturally imminent due to old age or an incurable terminal illness. The purpose is to embrace death with absolute mindfulness, detaching from all worldly desires, including the desire for food and water, and to purge the soul of remaining karma in the final moments of life. It is the ultimate act of non-violence or ahimsa towards oneself, allowing the body to wither away without struggle or complaint rather than prolonging life through artificial means that may involve harm to other living beings. The process is highly ritualized. It cannot be undertaken on a whim. It requires permission from community elders and family. The individual consciously renounces all worldly attachments, seeks forgiveness for all transgressions, and enters a state of deep meditation, gradually reducing and then ceasing intake of food and water until the body peacefully shuts down over a period of days or weeks. For Jains, this is not suicide, which is seen as a passionate, violent act born of emotion. Salikhana is its opposite, a dispassionate, holy, and rational letting go of the physical body at its appointed time, a final spiritual victory over the cycle of birth and death. What unites these disparate traditions, the warrior's violent atonement, the senator's defiant control, and the ascetic's peaceful renunciation, is the profound ritualization of the act. Each culture developed a strict procedure, a specific set of steps that elevated a deeply personal end into a socially significant event. The presence of witnesses was crucial. In seppuku, the audience verified the samurai's courage. In Rome, a suicide was a political statement meant to be heard. In Salikhana, the community supports and venerates the individual's passage. These were not private exits but public performances designed to communicate a powerful message about honor, piety, and the individual's relationship to their community and their gods. They represent a breathtaking reclamation of agency, a final declaration that even in death, how one dies can define a lifetime. While the rituals and sacrifices we've explored were driven by deep faith, they also fueled one of the most powerful economic engines of the ancient world, the temple itself. These were not simply houses of worship, they were the central banks, warehouses, and administrative hubs of their time, amassing wealth on a scale that rivaled and often surpassed that of kings. In civilizations like Mesopotamia and the Kingdom of Judah, the divine and the dollar were inextricably linked, with the gods serving as the ultimate silent partners in vast, sacred enterprises of accumulation. The primary revenue stream for these institutions was the system of tithes and offerings, a religious duty that functioned as a form of taxation. In ancient Sumer, a city's entire economy was oriented around its temple, the home of its patron deity. Farmers were required to give a portion of their harvest, often as much as 10%, to the temple granaries. Shepherds donated from their flocks, and artisans offered a share of their crafted goods. These weren't voluntary donations, they were obligatory payments owed to the god for the privilege of working the land they owned. You read that correctly, the deity was considered the literal owner of the city and all its territory. The king was merely the god's chief administrator, and the people were their tenants. This belief transformed every transaction into a divine exchange, making the temple the ultimate landlord and beneficiary of all economic activity. Beyond these regular tithes, there were the vast spoils of war dedicated to the gods in gratitude for victory. When a Mesopotamian king like Hammurabi conquered a rival city, the plunder, gold, silver, precious stones, exotic woods, and captured statues of foreign gods was not taken to the royal palace as a personal trophy. It was ceremoniously paraded through the streets and presented at the temple of the victorious city's patron deity, usually Marduk or Ishtar. This served a dual purpose. It visibly demonstrated the superior power of your god over the enemies, and it massively enriched the temple's coffers. The treasures were stored in heavily guarded temple treasuries, becoming the divine war chest, a tangible measure of both religious fervor and imperial might. The scale of this accumulation is best illustrated by the first temple in Jerusalem, built by King Solomon. The biblical books of Kings and Chronicles describe its construction being funded by immense quantities of gold and silver. Once operational, it became the sole center for sacrificial worship, meaning every single Israelite family was required to bring their offerings there. This created a constant inbound flow of livestock, grain, wine, and oil. The temple's storage facilities, its chambers and courtyards, would have been a sprawling, bustling depot, managing a perishable inventory that required an army of priests, Levites, and administrators to oversee. The sheer volume of animals brought for Passover, for instance, would have required an entire supporting industry of inspectors, money changers to convert foreign currency into the sacred shekel, and salesmen selling approved sacrificial doves to the poor. This wasn't just a religious site, it was a massive, state-mandated economic vortex pulling in the wealth of the entire nation. This concentration of resources bestowed immense economic and political power upon the priestly class who managed it. In Mesopotamia, the Intu priests and priestesses were not just spiritual leaders, they were CEOs of massive agricultural and commercial conglomerates. The temple owned vast estates, managed huge herds, and operated workshops that produced textiles, leather goods, and cultic objects. They could loan out grain and silver from their stores at interest, effectively acting as the central bank, providing capital for trade ventures and profiting from the interest. This placed the temple at the very heart of the economy, with the high priest often wielding more influence than the king himself, who relied on the temple's wealth and divine sanction to fund his building projects and military campaigns. With such immense, unsupervised wealth, corruption was almost inevitable. The biblical prophets, figures like Jeremiah and Amos, repeatedly railed against the priests of Jerusalem for exploiting the poor, taking the choicest cuts of meat for themselves, and turning the house of prayer into a den of robbers. They accused the religious elite of performing the rituals flawlessly while ignoring justice and mercy, using their sacred office for personal enrichment and social privilege. While the devout believed the offerings belonged to God in practical terms, they were controlled by men who could easily divert the best resources for their own comfort and luxury, hiding behind the unassailable veil of divine authority. This incredible concentration of wealth made temples the most tempting targets for any conquering army. Looting a royal palace yielded a king's ransom, but sacking a major temple could finance an empire for a generation. The fates of these sacred treasuries read like a history of ancient power shifts. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II famously plundered the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE, carting off all its golden vessels and treasures to Babylon. Centuries later, the Persian king Cyrus the Great, upon conquering Babylon, pointedly reversed this policy. He returned the sacred items to the Jews and funded the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem, a masterstroke of propaganda that painted him as a liberator sent by their own god. This was followed by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who not only looted the temple but desecrated it by erecting an altar to Zeus in its holy precincts, an act that sparked the Maccabean revolt. The cycle was relentless. Conquerors understood that to truly dominate a people, you didn't just defeat their army, you seized their god's wealth, proving your own deity's superiority and stripping the conquered nation of its economic and spiritual heart in one decisive strike. The temple's wealth was both the ultimate symbol of a civilization's prosperity and the brightest beacon for its eventual destroyers. Moving from the calculated strategies of Aztec flower wars, we encounter a form of combat where victory was measured not in captured prisoners, but in gruesome, tangible trophies taken from the slain. For many warrior cultures, the ultimate proof of valor and the most potent method of harnessing an enemy's spirit was the practice of head hunting. This was far more than mere barbarism. It was a deeply ritualized system of spiritual exchange, social status, and psychological warfare, where the severed head of a foe became a sacred object, a conduit of power, and a permanent testament to a warrior's prowess. The Celts of Iron Age Europe were particularly renowned for this practice, striking terror into the hearts of their Mediterranean adversaries. Classical authors like the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus vividly describe Celtic warriors embalming the heads of their most esteemed enemies in cedar oil, carefully preserving them to be displayed in their homes or even used as drinking cups during feasts. To the modern mind, this is the stuff of nightmares, but for a Celtic chieftain, these grisly artifacts were his most prized possessions. The head was believed to be the seat of the soul, the container of a person's life force, wisdom, and courage. By taking and keeping the head of a brave opponent, the victor wasn't just commemorating a kill, he was capturing and controlling that essence, preventing the enemy's spirit from finding rest while simultaneously absorbing their strength for himself. It was the ultimate spiritual conquest. The act of display was a public declaration of one's power, a warning to rivals, and a vital step in a young warrior's path to manhood. A man could not truly claim full status within the tribe until he had taken a head in battle, proving his courage and his ability to contribute to the community's spiritual and martial strength. This belief in the captured head's power resonates powerfully across the globe, finding one of its most sustained expressions among the indigenous tribes of Southeast Asia, such as the Dayak people of Borneo and the Naga of Northeast India. For these cultures, headhunting was intricately woven into the agricultural cycle and the very well-being of the village. The taking of a head was not a random act of violence, but a necessary ritual to ensure fertility for the crops and prosperity for the community. A successful headhunting raid would be followed by elaborate ceremonies where the skull was purified, offered food and drink, and invited into the village as an honored, albeit captive, guardian spirit. The entire community would celebrate, believing the acquired head would bless their fields and protect them from misfortune. Young men seeking to marry and establish their own households were required to present a head to demonstrate they could provide not just materially, but spiritually for their future family. The head was a currency of both social standing and cosmic balance, a sacred responsibility that turned the act of war into a dire necessity for communal survival. In the Americas, a similar, if slightly less extreme, practice emerged in the form of scalping. While popular culture often reduces it to a frontier atrocity, its roots are deeply embedded in the rituals of many Native American tribes. The scalp, the skin and hair taken from the crown of the head, was likewise seen as a repository of spiritual energy and life force. Taking a scalp was a way to capture a portion of an enemy's power and symbolically count a coup or act of bravery. The rituals surrounding it were precise. The scalp would be cleaned, stretched on a hoop, and often painted red. It might be used in victory dances or carried on a pole, not merely as a boast but as a potent talisman. The practice was so effective as psychological warfare that European colonizers and later American authorities tragically institutionalized it, placing bounties on scalps to incentivize the killing of indigenous people, brutally twisting a sacred practice into a tool of genocide. The underlying logic connecting these diverse traditions is a universal one. In a world animated by spiritual forces, the body, and particularly the head, is not just a physical vessel but a container of intangible power. To dominate an enemy completely, you must dominate not only their body but their spirit. By taking a head, a scalp, or another body part, a warrior achieved this ultimate domination. He demonstrated his courage to his community, secured his social rank, and harnessed a supernatural force to protect and nourish his people. It was a brutal equation, but one that made perfect sense within its cultural context, a stark reminder that the symbols of honor and horror are often separated only by the beliefs of the society that creates them. But the powerful link between spiritual devotion and physical intimacy was not confined to the temples of the ancient Near East. This complex tradition manifested in strikingly similar yet culturally distinct ways across the globe, creating classes of women whose lives were dedicated to the gods through a fusion of art, ritual, and sexuality. In India, this took the form of the Devaдаsis, the servants of the god, a system with roots stretching back over 1,000 years. Young girls, often from families seeking divine favor or social mobility, were formally married to a temple deity in an elaborate ceremony, symbolized by tying a pendant, the tali, around their neck. From that moment on, they were considered Nitya Sumangali, eternally married and blessed, unable to become widows, which granted them a unique and respected social status. Their primary duty was to become masters of classical dance, particularly Bharatanatyam, and music, performing these sacred arts as a form of worship during daily temple rituals and major festivals. Their movements were not entertainment, they were a divine offering, a means of embodying the divine and channeling blessings to the community. However, their role extended beyond performance. As living brides of the god, they were believed to hold his essence within them. This made them highly sought after by wealthy temple patrons and nobility. It became customary for these powerful men to seek a Devadasi as a consort, a relationship that was not seen as adulterous but as a form of receiving the deity's grace through his human vessel. The temple, in turn, received generous donations for these arranged partnerships, creating a lucrative flow of wealth that supported the entire religious complex. For centuries, this system operated in a delicate balance, with some Devadasis achieving great fame, wealth, and influence as celebrated artists and courtesans. Yet the potential for exploitation was woven into its very fabric. As the system evolved, particularly during the medieval period, the spiritual aspect began to erode in many regions, overshadowed by the economic one. The dedication of girls could become less a sacred vow and more a financial transaction, with families effectively selling their daughters to the temple. The Devadasis' autonomy over their bodies and their art could diminish, transforming them from respected artist priestesses into commodities controlled by temple authorities and wealthy patrons. A parallel tradition flourished on the island of Cyprus, the legendary birthplace of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Here, at her grand sanctuary at Paphos, a class of women served as hierodules or sacred slaves. The Phoenicians, who controlled Cyprus for a time, brought their own fierce goddess of love and war, Astarte, whose worship seamlessly blended with that of Aphrodite. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that these women offered themselves to male devotees as part of the cult's rituals. For a pilgrim arriving by ship, engaging with a hierodule was likely the first act upon landing, a ritual of purification and dedication to the goddess before proceeding to the temple. The fees from these encounters, along with the votive offerings left by sailors thankful for safe passage, made the sanctuary of Aphrodite at Paphos one of the wealthiest in the entire Mediterranean. The practice was so central to the island's identity and economy that the word Cyprus itself became a slang term in later Latin for a prostitute, a stark indication of how the sacred and the profane had become inextricably linked in the outside world's perception. The decline of these practices was almost universally triggered by the collision with foreign cultural and religious values. In India, the arrival of British colonial rule in the 19th century proved catastrophic for the Devadasi tradition. Victorian missionaries and officials, armed with a rigid, puritanical moral code, were horrified by what they saw as religiously sanctioned prostitution. They willfully ignored the system's deep spiritual and artistic roots, recasting the Devadasis not as artists and priestesses, but as victims and common sex workers. This misinterpretation provided the moral justification for a series of legislative acts, starting in the 1930s and 40s, that outlawed the dedication of girls to temples and stripped the Devadasis of their former legal rights and protections. Without the temple structure, many were left destitute, their artistic skills devalued and their social status destroyed, often forcing them into the very kind of exploitative sex work the laws had ostensibly sought to eliminate. A rich, complex, and ancient tradition was brutally dismantled by an outside power that failed to understand its cultural context. A similar fate befell the temples of Aphrodite and Ishtar as the Hellenistic world gave way to the rise of the Roman Empire and later Christianity. The new Christian morality preached a complete separation of the physical from the spiritual, championing celibacy and viewing the body as a source of sin. The idea that sexual acts could be a form of divine worship was not just foreign to this worldview, it was heretical and demonic. Emperor Constantine's conversion and the subsequent adoption of Christianity as the state religion of Rome led to the systematic closure of pagan temples and the suppression of their rites. The great temples were abandoned, repurposed as churches, or dismantled for building materials, and the hierodules who once served the goddess were scattered, their sacred role recast as a sinful one. The memory of their practices was preserved only in the condemnatory writings of the early Church Fathers, who used them as lurid examples of pagan depravity to rally the faithful. This historical lens, filtered through centuries of Judeo-Christian and colonial perspective, is why we so profoundly misinterpret these practices today. We view them through a binary prism of either sacred piety or profane sexuality. The modern mind struggles to conceive of a world where a sexual act could be a sincere, non-exploitative form of worship, a direct transaction with the divine meant to ensure communal fertility and prosperity. We either romanticize these women as free-spirited priestesses or reduce them to victims of a predatory system. The truth, as always, lies in a more complicated middle ground. For every Divadosi who may have been coerced, there was likely another who found genuine spiritual purpose, social standing, and artistic fulfillment in her role. For every hierophant serving out of obligation, another may have felt she was performing a vital, honored service for her goddess and her community. To label it all as mere prostitution is to erase its profound religious significance and to ignore the fact that in the ancient world, the most powerful forces of life, sex, death, and divinity were not separate realms but intimately and inextricably woven together. And so our journey through these 25 forbidden practices draws to a close. A voyage from the blood-soaked altars of the Aztecs to the sacred intoxication of Eleusis, from the ritualized death of kings to the sacred duties of temple priestesses. We have witnessed how entire civilizations once built their worldviews upon foundations that now seem unthinkable, where human sacrifice was a sacred duty, infanticide a grim necessity, and ritualized torture a divine performance. This journey reveals a profound and humbling truth. Our concepts of morality, taboo, and the sacred are not fixed points on a compass, but are instead shaped by the relentless currents of time, environment, and belief. What binds these disparate practices together is a universal human drive to make sense of a chaotic world, to seek control over the uncontrollable, and to connect with forces greater than ourselves. Whether through the extreme piety of the Galli's self-castration or the calculated power of the Roman arena, ancient peoples were attempting to answer the same fundamental questions we grapple with today. They used the tools and understanding they had to ensure fertility, avert disaster, maintain social order, and appease the gods they believed governed every aspect of existence. The methods shock us, but the underlying desires for security, meaning, and community are entirely recognizable. These customs expose the raw architecture of power, showing how religion, politics, and social control were often indistinguishable, with the bodies of the vulnerable slaves, prisoners, women, and the poor frequently serving as the currency for maintaining that power. This exploration forces us to hold two competing ideas in our minds at once. We can and should feel a modern revulsion at practices like Aztec mass sacrifice or the grim fate of the Spartan infant, recognizing the profound human suffering they caused. Yet, we must also resist the arrogant temptation to view our ancestors as simple-minded or barbaric. They were complex humans operating within a vastly different framework of reality, one where the survival of the community could justify the sacrifice of the individual, and where the line between the spiritual and the physical was blurred, if it existed at all. This leads us to a final, crucial reflection. If the norms of the past seem so foreign and forbidding to us now, what does that suggest about our own present? The taboos we hold as absolute and self-evident today, our own deeply ingrained beliefs about life, death, ethics, and the body, may one day be viewed by our descendants with the same mixture of curiosity, confusion, and condemnation. Our unquestioned practices, from our industrial treatment of animals to our carceral systems, may be the future's forbidden ancient mysteries. This isn't a call for moral relativism, but for humility and self-awareness. History teaches us that societal change is the only constant, and the most profound progress often begins by questioning the very things we assume to be inherently right or normal. We've covered immense ground, but this is just the beginning of the conversation. I'm deeply curious to know which of these 25 practices you found the most shocking, the most fascinating, or the most difficult to understand. Was it the spiritual logic behind Aztec cannibalism, the bleak pragmatism of Cannibaliside in the Arctic, or the sacred ecstasy of the Pythia at Delphi? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss what these ancient mysteries reveal about us today. If you enjoyed this dive into history's hidden shadows, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next exploration into the forgotten corners of our past. Thank you for